Alright, the second section of part 2 of Atonement, which I'm starting on page 202, shows Robbie continuing to retreat towards Dunkirk with the rest of his men, and also shows him, dwelling on what's happened to him and the changes that have come over him and his relationship with Cecilia. We're told about 7 or 8 lines down page 202 that he was thinking about the French boy asleep in his bed and about the indifference with which men could lob shells into a landscape. So he's seen this leg and he's got pyjamas on, he realises it's a child. A French boy who was asleep who's just been bombed. And I think the word lob is really important because it suggests it's just done without any care. So there's that idea that a life is just sort of carelessly thrown away. And again, that's a massive contrast to earlier on in the novel. Now we've got a death just treated just completely as though it's normal. And I think you could also see that as a symbol of what Brian has done, that she has sort of lobbed, without care. She's told this lie and it's thrown his life and blown his life apart. And I think throughout part 2 we get that metaphor continuing, really, that Briony's destruction is echoed in the destruction of the war contextually. Obviously that's because she's going back and telling the story, knowing what happened to Robbie as a result both of her lie and of the war. We're told about a third of the way down the page it was an industrial process. So again, Robbie's reflecting on the way that it's almost like a factory line of destruction and death. There's a great link to Hard Times there. Gradgrind also is this big industrialist who believes in utilitarianism and that that Britain is great when the factories are working. I think there's also a nice link to Paul Marshall, who is selling chocolate bars. He has got this industrial process going of selling these chocolate bars, but he's getting rich out of this destruction. About 3/4 of the way down the page, we're told 3.5 years of nights like these, unable to sleep, thinking of another vanished boy, another vanished life that was once his own. So that's that link again, isn't it, that Robbie's life is very much like that French boy's. It's being destroyed by this careless lie, in the way that the French boy's life was destroyed by this careless, bombing of his area. 202 to page 203, Robbie remembers Cecilia's words, "I'll wait for you, come back." So that's that recurring motif throughout the novel that keeps him going. Remember, that's also what Cecilia said to Bryony when she'd have nightmares. So again, we've got that link there between Bryony's guilt and the actual reality of what is happening to Robbie that she's telling us about later on after the event. When we get over to page 204, we're told still sleep would not come for Robbie. Now I think that's the very, very end of the novel where Bryony says, "But now I must sleep." And I think that's really, really interesting because there's the idea of unfinished business, isn't there? Sleep will not come for Robbie because his life hasn't been got back on track. At the very end of the novel, when we're told the reality, Bryony, "Now I must sleep." So there's that idea that for both Robbie and Bryony at this point, there's unfinished business. Things aren't sorted yet, so this sleep can't come. About halfway down, we're told about Robbie and Cecilia's relationship and the way they'd write to each other. We're told he was naturally in love with her words. When he wrote back, he pretended to be his old self. He lied his way into sanity. So again, words, writing, language is sort of the answer. Okay, that's the way that Robbie regains his innocence and his childhood that he's lost. There's also the idea of lied his way into sanity, which I think again becomes ironic at the end, where Bryony, we realise, has lied to deal with her own guilt. So again, we've got that parallel between them. We're told a few lines after that, about 3/4 of the way down the page, they wrote about literature, they used characters as codes. It's exactly what Bryony's done, isn't it? She's seen and read these stories and put her real life into that. That's how she decided that Robbie was this maniac. Robbie and Cecilia are doing the same thing. This is a book about how we all, understand our lives through these literary events, through these stories. A bit later on, we're reminded of different characters, and we're told about Mr. Knightley and Emma, Venus and Adonis, Turner and Tallis, about 4 lines before the end. So Robbie literally puts himself and Cecilia alongside these great literary characters. It's ironic because they only exist in this book at the end, they only exist in the story that Bryony's written. But again, it also shows how we all think of ourselves in this way. We all understand our life through language and through stories. On page 205, we're told that Robbie and Cecilia did very briefly meet. And we're told this moment had been imagined and desired for too long and could not measure up. So the actual reality of their meeting after all the time doesn't match up to the letters and what they'd hoped for. And again, there's that idea that real life doesn't match up to the story. The Trials of Arabella in reality isn't as good as Bryony wanted in her head. And actually this story, Atonement, is better than the reality, isn't it? Because the reality is that Robbie and Cecilia died. So that's an ongoing symbol throughout the book, that the stories that we tell ourselves are always a little bit better than real life. Real life can never quite match up. Cecilia tells Robbie about working in hospitals, and she says about halfway down page 207, when she described a happy outcome, that moment when the battle was over and an exhausted mother took the child in her arms for the first time and gazed in rapture into a new face, it was the unspoken call to Cecilia's own future. So she writes about these stories. Again, there's the language of war. It's the battle was over when a baby was born. But there's also that idea, isn't there, that a new baby is a form of redemption. The hope of children for Robbie and Cecilia and being told about new life is a form of redemption. Just like in Hard Times, Sissy's childhood innocence is something that redeems Louisa in Hard Times. On page 209, about a third of the way down, Cecilia writes to Robbie and tells him, she wrote in reply, "They turned on you, all of them, even my father." Again, I think we see AO3, the context really come in there, the idea of them versus Robbie, that they're divided very clearly by their class, that it's completely separate, and that's gone into a bit more detail about halfway down page 209. I'm beginning to understand the snobbery that lay behind their stupidity. My mother never forgave you your first. So again, the idea that the Tallises live in this world of real class divisions, but the world around them is changing. Robbie, albeit with their help, Robbie has got this first, Robbie has been bettering himself, and it's that idea that their world is sort of crumbling, that they live in a world where class is a much sort of bigger deal maybe than it is going to be in the future. About 3/4 of the way down page 210, she finishes the letter by saying, "I'll wait for you, come back." She was quoting herself, she knew he would remember, and that line, remember, comes up again and again and again throughout the story. And the Atonement, the novel, is Bryony's way of making Robbie come back to life. And then we are told when Cecilia writes to Robbie, so on page 211, we get a little break and we see the letter, and she's telling him about Bryony. And we're told Bryony isn't at Cambridge just before the end of page 211. She didn't go up last autumn, she didn't take a place. I was amazed. So we get the idea that Bryony's rebelling from the expected path. She doesn't go to Cambridge like Cecilia did. She takes on nursing. So again, Bryony's stepping out of that Tallis bubble. She's escaping those expectations of that life. We're told on page 212, about a quarter of the way down, I get the impression she's taken on nursing as a sort of penance. Again, that idea that her life as a nurse is the atonement. Part 3 of the book about her life as a nurse is the resolution and the atonement of this story. And that's what it means to Bryony. We're told about 3/4 of the way down page 212, I keep thinking of her. To go into nursing, to cut herself off from a background is a bigger step for her than it was for me. So again, that idea that she's actually escaped parental control. Just like in Hard Times, Louisa escapes the influence of her parents and changes things around. And we get that idea that Bryony needs to leave that childhood behind to actually move on and to actually redeem herself. And then at the very, very end of the letter on page 213, we're told, I love you, I'll wait for you, come back, see. So again, that come back is that recurring motif throughout part 2, in the same way as it was in part 1 for Bryony, as Cecilia tells her to come back after a nightmare, and comes back in part 3 as well, when actually Bryony does make Cecilia and Robbie come back in this book that she's written for her own atonement. Okay, so that's the next little bit of part 2.